right. Welcome to the Sunday night broadcast of the Church Safety Guys. I am James, and I'm joined by Paul and Mike. You do that intentionally. Like if we're going to start recording, I think we're going to start recording the backside, like the blooper clips, and playing those. Because honestly, every time I add the theme music, Paul's doing a little dance in the background, and it cracks me up. And I can't really say anything or do anything because I'll have to introduce the show.
This is why James always looks flustered when he first starts the
show. So anyway, crazy weekend. I mentioned it to you guys, but this is the first time that I've actually sat down all weekend. I did two. Yesterday I did a CCW class, and then today I did a CCW class, and then I had to rush home to a church leadership meeting and spent some time going through some stuff there. And so now I'm actually sitting down. I have my water. I have my book from Simon. I've been reading that. So, but if you're joining us, thanks for hanging out with us. We moved the time back to 7. 7 Eastern. We're gonna try and work that out and see how that works to make it a little bit easier on us and you guys not staying up so late. But if you're joining us, feel free to list where you're from, and we always appreciate you guys listing your churches and that sort of thing. So tonight we are going to do kind of 2 sessions, but both sessions we're going to be joined by Simon with Kingswood Security and Worship Security Association, and his book was our book of the month that we were recommending this month. And that book is entitled Church Safety: Responding to Suspicious Activity. So we're going to talk to him a little bit about that. And then we're also going to talk about bias. And that's a topic that we haven't addressed yet, really, in the show, in the broadcast. And I think that it's important to address it because of some of the things that are going on in our culture right now with churches and that sort of thing. And honestly, I can't think of a better person to bring into that discussion than Simon. So we will be chatting about that. But so if you're joining us, thanks for hanging out. I did want to do a quick comment on some of our books and kind of explain a little bit of that and what's going on. So real quick, you guys might have noticed that we actually released a new copy of War Ready, and that new copy we actually went back through and we added a group study portion, and we actually changed it around a little bit. So the content is still the same. So if you're like, hey, I bought War Ready, do I need to go buy it again? Well, if you want to go buy it again, I'm not going to stop you.
Yeah.
But we had a few people reached out to us and said, look, we'd like to use this as a group study. So I actually went back through and kind of put in a group study and then kind of tweaked it a little bit to be more like the layout with the road less traveled. So we have those 2 books. They're both available on Amazon. And then also the PowerPoint for the group study. Both of those PowerPoint presentations are available free on our website as a resource to you guys. So if you decide to do that as a group study, you can download those resources and be real active with it. So one thing I will say real quick, we've had a few people ask us about the road less traveled and how it was different than War Ready and that sort of thing. So I uploaded kind of a picture to show you guys, and it's not available on Amazon. So when Amazon does the look here or look inside, it doesn't get to the actual devotional part. So this is actually what it looks like. So you have the devotional on one side, and then you have a spot on the right side for actually writing notes, prayer notes, study notes, etc. And then from that from that standpoint, if you're working with your team or you're doing a group study through the week, you can jot down notes, and then when you get to your week group study, you can go back and look up notes on specific verses and stuff like that. So that's kind of why we did that. And now, we have those two. Mike is posting the links and everything for me. So thank you for doing that. I appreciate it. And as always, I mean, if you have questions about that, feel free to reach out to us. And I'm thinking about trying to get somebody to do a voiceover and like do audiobooks and stuff like that. So I don't know.
I wonder if we know anybody.
Who could we get that could do that?
But I am, and here's another thing, and everybody's laughing at me about this, but I am in the process of actually trying to translate both books into Spanish. And the reason is because we have a lot of Spanish churches in Texas, in California, in Florida, across the southern border. And I would love to have, resources available for those folks as well. In our Facebook group, we have quite a few Spanish speaking churches from California that are part of that group. So I think it would kind of be a blessing to be able to do that. So did you have something you wanted to add to that, Paul?
I did quickly. I like to cut up, but in all seriousness, if you've not seen the link to, and I think Simon's getting that for us so that Mike can put it up. But if you have not listened to the podcast, the Who I Became podcast, which Simon does, and he interviewed James on, you're missing out, and you need to. And it should whet your appetite for the road less traveled. I'm looking forward to my copy, and hopefully it's autographed. But anyway, I am, in all seriousness, I am looking forward to my copy. And then on the backside of that, if you have not seen the new cover art, you can see it kind of small in the bottom of the frame here, kind of over here. But that it's a completely redesigned cover art for that, the new book, which again, if you are trying to find a spiritual aspect to your team and you're trying to keep your safety team on a spiritual note, and you want to be able to do something, even if it's a Zoom Bible study, or if you're just kind of keeping track with each other during the week, this literally is something that you can actually have a Bible study and talk about real life circumstances that happen. So this is actually something that really, really takes experiences and lets people build on it. And let's face it, a lot of times in church safety, it's all about getting out there and getting to our post. And in a lot of cases, churches don't even pray. So I think that James has really gone the extra mile with this. That might be a bit of a pun based on the road less traveled, but he's taken that to the next mile marker, I think, in all seriousness. So.
Well, I appreciate that. And, if you haven't, Simon does a great job with Who I Became in that series. So if you haven't had the opportunity to actually go back and listen to some of his series, that would be really cool. This is actually the official cover of the new War Ready. And we kind of had it designed by the same gentleman that did The Road Less Traveled, just to create some continuity between the books and that sort of thing. So again, if you've never purchased it and you're looking for a resource for your church and that sort of thing, the group study edition is great for that. If it's just for you, you can purchase either edition. It's just the original War Ready that we have out there is a little bit smaller, and it doesn't have some of the group features and some of the journaling features and that sort of thing. But again, the content is still there. And as always, when we sell one of those from Amazon, 100% of the margin that we make off of that, which is minimal, goes straight back into the Church Safety Guys ministry. And a lot of times what we'll do is, we put that into providing resources to churches and smaller churches that can't afford that. So for sure a good opportunity. So we are going to talk with Simon tonight, and I'm going to go ahead and bring him in if I can. There he is.
Good evening,
Hey,
everyone.
Simon.
Hey, Simon.
How are we all doing?
Good, sir.
Soundproofing in the background there, is that what I'm seeing?
Yeah, you guys are going for your office look. I'm starting to go more of the studio type feel. So I thought I'd mix it up a little bit.
Nice.
He's
Have you got a
getting
good smooth jazz voice?
Well, the reason is that when I talk to Tina Rowe and I'm in my office, she always says, Simon, you've got your look at me wall behind you. So, every person has a bit of an ego. So I'm trying to play it down a little bit and just have a sort of a blank canvas behind me. So
I'm kind of jealous because now I feel like I have to go out and make a professional studio because all I have in the background is books and Disney memorabilia and
well, there's a couple of things. One I would say is the soundproofing keeps falling off the wall, so don't be surprised if it falls off. And then second, like any studio, you don't want to see what's in front of me. So
Right.
But I guess, gentlemen, thank you for having me on your show again. This is the third or fourth time you've invited me back, so you must feel I have something to offer your listeners. So I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful what you do.
Well, thank you. It's always fun having you on, and I think all of us probably talk to you just as much during the week as we talk to each other. So,
well, and wives as well, I should think. Yeah, my wife often says I talk to you and Paul more than her, but that's.
Yeah. See, I don't want to get on her bad side. I'm just not interested in going there. I feel like maybe. She has experience with special ops or something like that. So,
well, she's a special ops wife, so she knows it's fine. It's good as gold.
Exactly. So your book on suspicious behavior. What I'm just kind of curious for those that don't know or haven't had a chance to actually pick it up and read it. What motivated you to actually do that book and to get that published?
Yeah, and so the interesting thing, the desire to get it published was you forcing me, James, because bizarrely, so what happened is, I'll tell you a bit of the story. So those that don't know me, I spent time in law enforcement in the UK and other crazy stuff. And then when I emigrated here, I was in charge of counterterrorism all of America. And that's really where I got into security ministry. I was overseeing a team that focused on suspicious behavior, sort of behavior analysis. And then a friend up one day asked me and said, can you come and talk to my church on suspicious behavior? And that's really where it was all sort of born. And I've had this class, what I now call responding to suspicious behavior based on house of worship. And I've self-published a book for myself for the last 3 or 4 years, but haven't had it on Amazon, some of these things like you do, James. And bizarrely, at the start of the year, I had an email from a guy, and bearing in mind I'm an English guy in Minnesota. This guy was on a plane, I think going from LA to San Diego somewhere. And he said, I'm sat on a plane next to a guy and he's doing your workbook. And where can I get a copy from? And me being me, I was like, what workbook are you talking about? We had some email back and forth. He said, your suspicious behavior workbook. I said, well, I normally sell that when you go through my class. I don't actually sell it online anywhere. And he said, well, do you mind if I have a copy? I said, well, yeah, give me your address and I'll send you a copy. So that's really what forced me to get it onto Amazon. You having the push thinking, but I need this book to go wider. But really, the class is actually based on four there's 4 components of the class, and I really take people through. Why do we have safety and security in worship? So sort of high level awareness. Teach them about suspicious behavior. When we're in a faith organization, there's a lot of layers to unpack when we say that word: suspicious behavior, unusual behavior, breaking of social boundaries.
Sure.
And most suspicious behavior is tied into a form of surveillance. So for those that know me, I used to do surveillance in England, across Europe. I'm not talking about ducking into shop doorways or walking into an office strange, that sort of James Bond type stuff. Just, what is it that a lot of these assailants do to be seen but not recognized? And then when we see that in worship, how do we then interact with them? So I have what I call conversational interviewing. So I used to oversee a program which is based on Israeli behavior analysis. Well, I'll throw it out there that in some parts of America, that concept doesn't work. And it's my belief that you take a lot of some of those Israeli concepts, if you're not well trained, if you don't understand the environment, they can have more harm than good. So I'm not saying that those Israeli techniques don't work in a church, but they're in a different world than what we are. I'm teaching 80-year-old Maggie to see some suspicious behavior and identify it. So it finishes with what I call conversational interviewing. So that's really the nature of the class. And then as it develops, I then built the workbook that sort of takes you through those 4 items. So the goal is by the end of taking the 4 sessions, you should have a good understanding of how to recognize and respond to suspicious behavior and do so from grace in a religious sort of environment.
Amen.
Yeah, and the book is actually really cool. We have, in fact, we have a couple of copies you sent us to give away, so we can definitely give one of those copies away to whoever's listening. What we'll do is we'll put whoever's watching the live feed. We'll put your name in a drawing, and then actually draw a person out for that. But the cool thing that I liked about it, like when I think you sent me a copy right after we had first met. The aspect of it that I really liked was that it's very practical. It's informative, but as you go through the book, there's different scenarios where, you kind of give the opportunity to people to role play and say, okay, how would you handle this type of situation? What would strike your attention and that sort of thing. And to be perfectly honest, again, bringing in, we'll talk about it in a little bit, probably after the break, but bringing in the idea of the bias and that component to me is really interesting, because I think for myself, I knew what it was in the back of my mind, but I never saw an actual label to it to say, here's explicit bias versus implicit. And, and so you did a video with a gentleman that we're also going to play. It's a very short video for the discussion, but it's great material because it really emphasizes and helps us. I think it helps us take a look at things that we've taken for granted and say, wait a second, maybe I'm being not prejudiced necessarily, but based on my thought process, I've always thought that this was the way something should be, versus actually kind of having more of an open mind.
Yeah, you're right. One of the concepts in there, I can't remember which section there is, but there is. We often talk in security about being evidence-based. This isn't necessarily just Simon's opinion. It's evidence-based, and it's based on a sort of a concept. And one of those is the Solomon Asch experiment. If you don't mind me just sort of talking about this for a minute, he was an American Polish psychologist, and in the 1950s, he did this conformity experiment. And it was based on that it was at Swarthmore College, which I believe is in New York or somewhere on the East Coast. And it was a male-dominated test. So, I mean, for those women listening, it was slightly biased towards men. But he basically took sort of 8 groups of 8 men, and everyone in there was an actor except one person that didn't know they were part of a test. And what he really did is he put 4 lines on like a sort of sheet of paper back at the time, A, B, C, D. And he told his actors to say, hey, James is the only person that doesn't know this. I'm going to ask James about, which is the taller line. And clearly, looking at the picture, line D is the tallest one. But we're going to send James last, and you other 7 people are going to say that line A is the tallest. And perhaps some of your listeners might have heard of this conformity experiment before. But he used that to manipulate their mind as to how they responded to the environment. And actually, when he did that and he changed where the actors sort of were, and the person at the very end, you know what he did? Because he was last in the group, he followed the group and said A. So I use these type of experiments to really say that the environment that we're in of a church also changes our mindsets. And what I mean by that is that someone walks in displaying suspicious behavior. We might be on a high alert, what's going on, and, is there a terrorist attack? Are they trying to steal? Well, is that not the same as a husband who's lost his wife? There's a restraining order, non-contact order, he can't see his kids, he's living in his car, and he wants $10. That same person who's going to try and steal your purse is going to lurk around the corridors. That father who's embarrassed and wants to borrow $10 from the church might be seen lurking around the corridors because the environment has changed who he is. So, but there's lots of things in there to really help you understand, well, what does all this mean? Because ultimately we've got to make these decisions as to what we're seeing. So, there is a lot of evidence-based practicality within that book, which will help a novice or even down to someone that works in law enforcement. I've had many cops and detectives that sat in my class and said, but there's nothing you can teach me, and then by the end of it they're saying, well, I learned something new here today about some of these concepts. So we always want to try and be evidence-based in what we're looking at.
Sure. I think it's great, and again, for the church that maybe is looking to have an informational training or class or something like that, but not maybe do it in-house. The book is really great for kind of self-paced and self-learning. And for me, again, when I went through it, I just, again, it was like somebody turned a light bulb on, because like I said, I mean, if I see someone suspicious that comes into the church, yes, I want to minister to them, I want to help them, but what is that suspicion based on? And that kind of helped me more understand, some of the nuances with myself, looking at stuff and saying, okay, is this really suspicious, or is it just me based on, my culture and my upbringing and everything else that would indicate, or life experiences that would indicate or push me in some way. But Paul, you had something you wanted to.
Yeah, this is really an exciting time to be alive for church safety teams, because going back 10 or 12 years, raise your hand if you've got the scars of learning the hard way. This stuff didn't exist, and we now have people who, left a bang and the gift of fear and Simon's book, and there's great material that's coming out that's helping us to understand. Colonel Dave Grossman, what hasn't he written that's applicable to church safety at some point? There's so much material that is now coming out to help us to understand things, to understand what goes on inside of our bodies, and to help us to understand things that we're not even conscious of happening, and how to detect different things in these environments. It's making the world safer. But we're able to get education that belonged to the military or law enforcement just a few short years ago. Corporate security, executive protection, close protection. These things were closely guarded secrets not that long ago, and they're coming down into the private sector to where we can have people who have a head on a swivel and a heart for God that can benefit this in the home church. I mean, that's just amazing to me.
Yeah, and one of the things, what I tried to do as making it into this workbook is, when I teach the class in person, I should say there's a 4-part video series that goes along with this, and maybe if Mike doesn't put it during this recording, we can put it in there later, is to make sure that you really understand the mindset and how it relates to church, and give you those sort of exercises you can do. And one quick example I'll give you. So in 2013, when we had the Boston Marathon bombing, one of the heroes that day was a gentleman called Jeff Bauman. There's some horrible pictures of him online where he lost his legs. Yeah, and he's in hospital, and he's almost fighting with the doctors and nurses. And what he's really saying is, give me a pen and give me a paper, because I know who did this. And actually, Jeff Bauman was right. he did identify the 2 brothers that were responsible for the Boston Marathon bombing.
White hat and black hat.
Sorry?
Yep. White hat and black hat.
Well, exactly. But if you look on YouTube, there's videos of him being interviewed in 60 Minutes, various different places, talking about it. Well, he was, I think, it was like a 19 or 20-year-old Costco worker at the time. So very similar to churches, just an everyday person. But when he was at the finish line, he saw those two brothers. All he had to do to potentially stop that event was go to one of the 400 police officers and say, I've just seen something which is different. All he had to do was go to a police officer and say, I've just seen something different. I say it here now, 7 years later, it seems very simple, but it's not having that mindset. The reason why? Because you're identifying someone as being different than myself. Am I saying that person doesn't belong? So when I put these challenging exercises in there and say, here's this, tragic event where over 300 people were injured and, 20 odd killed. Think about this 19, 20-year-old Costco worker, what he was going through. Why couldn't he go to a police officer and say, these two brothers here, they're wearing dark clothing, they've got no interest in the race, they keep putting these bags down that we know now how the pressure washers. Is that not the same when we're asking people in churches to identify suspicious behavior and things that are different than themselves? Well, Simon, and you teaching me this, am I saying that James isn't welcome here? Is James different in our community? So you've really got to unpack a lot of these layers to know that when you're in that situation, what might stop you from raising the alarm, and then how do you remove those and work through them? Because you've got an instant, you've got a few seconds to make that decision to say, I've got to talk to this person or I've got to raise the alarm. And it has to be based off some type of analysis. Remember when I said evidence-based? The worst thing you can say is, well, James is just suspicious. Well, why? James is suspicious because he's been stood in the same place for an extended period of time. James's behavior is suspicious because he's been trying door handles inside the church. He's wandering without a purpose. The service ended 4 hours ago, he's still here. You've got to give some type of qualifier, and we never do that. If we do that in churches, I've never come across anyone that hadn't said, oh yeah, Simon, I totally understand that. That's why that activity was suspicious. When we just say, this black person over here, they're suspicious. That's when it starts getting on that difficult area surrounding, are you profiling? Is that person not welcome? Because in a church, everyone is welcome. We want them to feel welcome.
I think, Simon, you've kind of said on two pieces there. I think we have two illustrations. The average church security person, which probably has a level of confirmation bias where they're looking at somebody and seeing too much suspect and not enough heart of somebody who needs to be there for church. So they're overthinking it. But in the case of the Boston bombing, I think that confirmation bias comes in, and they're saying their brain is protecting themselves, saying, I didn't just see something threatening or suspicious. And it protects your brain and says no, and tries to have you backpedal in your own mind to not deploy that, to not ask the cop for or mention something in that sense. So I think we see it on both sides, one that didn't necessarily step forward for good, but then those of us perhaps in church security that at times can get so wrapped in what we're seeing, we're excluding other things that are going on in context.
Yeah, and particularly, the faith piece is crucial here, because I hear that so often, that am I going against, what the Bible says if I say that person doesn't belong here, if I identify them as being different, and there's, you'll find within the workbook, there's 4 rules that I have. I try to teach laymen, as sort of James said, whatever I teach tries to go from, if you're strong background in law enforcement, or this is the first time you've heard it. And I have 4 rules of suspicious behavior, and the 4th rule is trust your instinct for things that look out of place. Trust your instinct. And the reason why I say that is that the 4 of us on this recording, I believe that I was created by God, a higher power. He gave me feelings, he gave me emotions. The human eye sees so many different colors of green because we're used to the predators trying to find us. When I have an emotion, that emotion came from God. So it's okay to reflect and say, why am I feeling this way? Because God created me and he gave me these feelings and emotions. They're not things that I should just dismiss. You've also got to trust your instincts and be brave and say, I have these instincts because God created me. What's he trying to communicate to me at this time? But again, it's got to be based on a rationale, not just just whether this is suspicious. It's suspicious because of, and give the qualifier.
I wanted to follow that really quick, and then I know we're going to have to jump to the break, so I'm going to be quick with this, James. This is a really important conversation to have, because you have a confirmation bias, but then you have a normalcy bias. And the New Zealand shooting, and people were just like, and the guy walks right past an entire group of people. Nobody called 911. Walks right into a mosque and starts shooting people. And I could tell you a dozen stories like it. As a civilian police chaplain, I've been in environments where people have watched people commit felonies and just watched them go. And when you ask them, nobody called 911. We had a looter after a major flood in my town. And this lady came up 2 hours later and she goes, "Gee, I wish you guys had been there. Just 2 blocks over, there was a guy looting." And I said, just real quick. And the cops were throwing their hands up. And I have a good rapport with people. I said, well, forgive me. I said, because she got pictures of him. And I said, "Did you call 911? And she goes, "Well, that's not my job." And so I've encountered people who run that gambit where they have a normalcy bias and they're like, "Oh, well, I'm thinking too much about this. I'm making more of this than there is." And then it goes over into, that's not really my job, or even fear of the unknown. Well, what happens if I call dispatch and they get mad at me? I've actually had people say, "Well, I don't even know what I would do if I called 911. And I think that even invades the church to the point of, well, I don't want to go up to that church safety person and make a scene, or one church safety person to the boss and say, I don't want to go up and be wrong. And we have to be willing to go, something just irks me, back to your point, Simon. God gave me these emotions for a reason. This doesn't look right. And I can't even verbalize why. Can I get a second set of eyes?
Yeah. And one of the quick ones, I know you've got to go to a break, I think, but one of the other rules that I have is about breaking the social boundaries. And the word suspicious can have a stigma. And a few years ago, I was thinking, well, what else can I say to try and articulate to someone, what do you go looking for? Because, my youngest son is 6, and my mother is 79. And you've got to try and teach both of these people. And what I found is if you say to someone, go looking for the break-in of a social boundary, you're not saying suspicious, you're just saying the break-in of a social boundary. It can be as much as I get into an elevator, there's me in there, and someone comes and stands next to me. They get in my personal space. Well, that person's broken the social boundary. When I'm walking down the sidewalk and someone's walking towards me and they keep maintaining eye contact with me, keep looking at me, my internal processing that is saying they're breaking my social boundary. It's raising my awareness to those situations. So it's really understanding, like I said, the book is just full of these little exercises to help you really understand where this is coming from. But the breaking the social boundary is a key way to articulate to anyone. Don't worry about suspicious behavior. If you see a breaking of a social boundary in this church, you tell me. And then that person can be empowered because they know what the boundaries are. And then if someone stands up during the service, they can raise the alarm. If someone comes in carrying something, they can raise the alarm,
I think I'm just going to make a quick comment, and then we'll.
I know I can talk on this all day.
You're good. This overflows into the next segment anyhow. But I think honestly, to kind of mention or tie it back into what Paul and Mike said, I think part of the reason, honestly, that we went from one extreme in our culture to another, right? So it used to be okay to, and we used the term profiling years ago. It used to be okay to be suspicious. It used to be okay to profile. But as far as church safety teams go now, people hesitate because they don't want to be labeled as the individual that caused a problem, or that, the boy that cried wolf in that scenario. And when we talk about it, when we think about it, usually what I tell my folks is I would rather have you come up to me and tell me a concern that I troubleshoot and I see really isn't an issue or isn't a concern, versus you skipping it because you're afraid that I may react in a different way than I should. And, we've talked about, all of us separately, not on a broadcast, have talked about law enforcement today and having the obligation to second guess their choices all the time because they're afraid of the repercussions from another situation happening to them. And I honestly think we're starting to see some of that bleed over into the church safety team world, where, we're seeing folks that are second guessing what's really important, what one of those broken boundaries is, to be able to draw a distinguishing line and say, okay, this isn't right. Something needs to change.
Yeah,
so
that's true. Yeah, very true.
Honestly, and somebody just posted, I can't see the name, but they just added, as a first responder, it is drilled into brains to keep our eyes moving and be thinking ahead at all times. And that really helps in those situations. It does, but also as a first responder, a lot of times we're drilled into, again, normalcy and understanding where that line is. And again, understanding what an explicit bias is versus implicit bias. And not everybody understands the difference from that. And we're actually going to take a quick break. We're going to play some videos from our sponsors for our broadcast. And then when we come back, we're actually going to jump back in with Simon and talk about the bias aspect of it and how that impacts church safety. So stay with us. We'll be back in just a few minutes.
My name is Jim Howard. I'm the Executive Director of Trinity Security Allies. I'm also the lead security person for Generations Christian Church here in Trinity, Florida. We run about a 35-man operation that we provide safety for the church through all the services and the different events that they have. This has been a really big thing for us to partner up with LaserShot and work with them in setting up church safety security scenarios. When we first got LaserShot back a year ago, the thing we liked about it the most was that it was teaching people who have concealed weapons permit and also law enforcement officers, putting them in scenarios that they would never be able to do at a shooting range, but putting them in a live scenario where they would have to make a split decision of whether to shoot or don't shoot. The scenarios that we shot today are based on real life situations. Domestic violence, where the husband comes in and attacks his ex-wife in the church. People trying to steal their children when they don't have custody of those children. These are the type of things that actual safety teams across the United States are going to run into. And of course, we do have the active shooters. And these are things that we have to pay attention to. There have been more and more active shooter situations going on in the United States right now. And so we have to be prepared. Whether it be overseas or in the United States, we have to be ready for what may face us in today's house of worships. My name is Jim Howard. I'm an Executive Director of Trinity Security Allies, and I train with LaserShot.
In the Message translation of the Bible, Proverbs 15, verse 1 says, "A gentle response diffuses anger." In my 20 years as a road patrol police officer, I have seen that work, a gentle response diffusing anger. I founded Gentle Response LLC in 2016 after observing that a vast majority of people who volunteer and work at churches do not have the background, training, or experience to properly handle a loud, rude, obnoxious person without inadvertently saying or doing something that actually escalates the situation. Gentle Response is not just another lecture presentation. I have a team of current and former police officers with decades of experience, and we conduct very dynamic, realistic conflict de-escalation training seminars and scenarios, which are specifically designed to help a person develop stress inoculation, muscle memory, self-confidence, and confidence in other colleagues. You will not develop all that from just sitting through a lecture presentation or just watching a training video. My team and I travel around the country, working with churches, businesses, corporations, state agencies, and law enforcement. We can help you and your personnel be much better prepared to effectively and successfully interact with a hostile, confrontational person and prevent a volatile situation from becoming a critical, violent incident. Contact me for more information or to lock in a training date at my webpage, gentle-response.com, or through your social media, your favorite social media platform. Just do a search for gentle response.
Church ministry is more often than not a hard, thankless journey. Church safety and security even more so. Down a narrow path, a steep and rocky path, a path with ups and downs and little rest along the way. A road that often is barely visible and indistinguishable on the journey of life, but one that makes the journey easier for others, forging the way and going into the unknown. Join us for an adventure down the road less traveled.
All right, and you are joining the Church Safety Guys. So welcome. That was kind of our break segment, and we try and do videos of our sponsors, so you have the opportunity to see who we're partnering with, and take a minute to thank them for partnering with us and sponsoring us in the broadcast. Now, we're talking with Simon with Kingswood Security and Worship Security Association about bias, and kind of going back to that topic. One of the comments, and you might have seen it, Simon, that somebody mentioned was, they said, "You must have a better educated congregation than mine. No one would understand breaking the social boundary." And, honestly, I have to appreciate that, because there's a lot of truth to that with what you said earlier with, trying to communicate and educate, your son versus a 79, your mom.
And I'll give you a real life example that happened at my church. Very, very quick on that is that a woman came in one day holding a box. She went to the front of the church and she had mental illness, and she was throwing things onto the stage, and was had a short altercation with the pastor. And people often say to me, "Well, how did you know about that?" Well, she broke the social boundary of, she came in holding an item. It was nothing to do with what she looked like. And so a lot of it is trying to articulate what are those breaking of social boundaries. So yeah, in the short time we've got here, I don't have the time to really teach you some of these. That's what the book and the training class is for. But
Right.
But even as a volunteer, you can try and just take the concept and work out, well, how can I say to someone, what are the things in your life that are acceptable, what's not acceptable to see, and sort of put a sort of a framework around it. That's really what the breaking of a social boundary really is. But if you look at the book, it sort of explains in there, but it's difficult in the time we've got to really go into that in any depth. But it does, if you can get through to someone, it does work.
I wanted to follow this because social boundaries, they differ largely by culture and by religious background and similar. And people don't realize how wild some of these can be. I've spent 10 years beside the badge as a chaplain, and we have a group of Marshall Islanders in my area, hardworking, very family oriented. And a police officer stepped up, and he was there to stand by while a medical team was working with someone injured, and he put his foot on the threshold of the door. And I believe that he said it was the Marshall Island culture. Several men in the house, there's a very family-oriented group there. They stood up to go attack him. And he's like, "What in the world?" Well, come to find out, in I believe it's the Marshall Islander culture, part of their religious belief is that the spirits of their dead ancestors live in the threshold, in the door frame. And so by stepping, by stepping and putting his foot deliberately, and what he was saying is, "I'm here," and he was positioning himself to go into the building without actually going in. And so he was just positioning himself in case something bad happened. And without realizing it, he stepped on a 500-pound bomb, and in another instance, I know a police officer who's a paramedic and spent a lot of time overseas, thank God. He dealt with a Somali Muslim family, and the guy had locked his wife outside to punish her in sub-zero temperatures. Very sad situation. She had hypothermia and was in a lightweight dress. And another family down the street had taken her in from the same culture and had taken her in. And he goes in the door, and she's shaking, and he starts talking to her, and he's trying to get her vitals. And one of the family members goes out the door and brings back 5 or 6 more guys to kick his tail. They were going to attack him, and he turned around, placed his hand on a high-speed wireless device he had on his hip, and said, "Listen to me, you need to understand something. We're having a cultural miscommunication." He said, "I am going to treat this woman's ills. I'm going to take care of her physically. The ambulance is going to arrive. She wants to go to the hospital. I am not trying to violate any religious differences here, but I'm not willing to let her die. And I mean, you see that all the way over to, I remember being a teenager, and there was a missionary group up from Puerto Rico. And I'm standing there as an American male from the Midwest, and this girl kept touching me the whole time. She's touching me, and she's standing right next to me. She was violating my space. I'm like, you stay over there. And I was thinking, this girl is hitting on me like hugely. And I was, of course, I was in an awkward age anyway. I don't know, but it just was funny because she kept bumping me and touching me, and she'd slip her arm around me and she'd smack me on the shoulder, and we're having this. And finally, there was a woman with the missionary group who was from the U.S., and she came up to me. She said, hey, I want you to understand something. When you get into certain cultures, and maybe Argentina, Brazil, Puerto Rico, different cultures, they think it's rude not to touch you when they're talking to you. They'll touch you if they just met you on the street. They'll literally walk up and touch you. And she literally means nothing by it. I can tell it really bothers you. It's got you flustered. Of course, I'm like a 15-year-old teenage boy. And I'm all kinds of flustered at that moment. And she said, don't take any, don't read into it. It's a cultural thing. And I think that was my first collision with other cultures and how wildly different they can be. Maybe your culture doesn't make eye contact when we talk, but in mine, it's a sign of respect. And so to go way back to what you're talking about, there's so many nuances to cultural boundaries and social boundaries that we need to know.
Yeah, and just very quickly, I don't want to move on to another subject, but just seeing in the comments, there's a couple of things I just want to very quickly touch on. One, there was a comment about the Boston Marathon bombing, would a cop really pay attention? Well, again, a police officer is sworn to protect. What you need to do is escalate to them. If they choose to do nothing with it, they choose to do nothing with it. But if it is, what you've got to do is say to them is that this behavior is unusual because of these 3 or 4 different qualifiers, and sort of pass the burden to them. So I would never come and just say that, a police officer is not going to do anything with it. It's a busy Boston. That's why they're there, is to keep people safe. And the second thing I just want to quickly touch on was Dave Davenport leaving a message about carrying a box around is a good clue. Well, is it a good clue? Because remember, the breaking of social boundaries is different depending who you are. We can quickly tie into those carrying backpacks. I personally, Paul and James know a lot of my background. I've been into a lot of crazy situations. I've been involved in a lot of undercover operations. I've been international. There's a lot of things that don't even register on my radar. Someone concealing and carrying, and I see that they've got a firearm in a church. That doesn't automatically bother me. The big thing that we hear about worship safety teams are, backpacks in a church, what are we going to do? A backpack in a church doesn't bother me because it's the person's intent that I need to find out. I don't care if they've got a backpack. I don't care if they're concealing and carrying, and I can actually see the firearm. What is their intent? That's what bothers me. So it's very different for each person. So don't get bogged down in what you believe. It's what you've got to articulate when your training is, well, what do you perceive to be a breaking of a social boundary? When you see that, then escalate to me, because mine is going to be very different depending on who the person is.
So I want to jump in.
Let's move on,
quick.
Because I know we're going to
we're
digressing a lot, but those are 2 things I wanted to come back on.
No, you're fine. So I was just going to tell you that you mentioned backpacks, and I was going to comment on that with Dave's message as well. What's interesting is there are certain things to me. Backpacks don't typically grab my attention. I usually look. Well, it will grab my attention, but then I look at the characteristics of the individual. Is the person sweaty? Are they fidgety? Are they nervous? That sort of thing. Right, the behavioral. And there was one particular time when we had a missionary come in with a briefcase. And that's another thing. I didn't know who the gentleman was, and briefcases to me are a thing of like the 70s. My dad used to have a briefcase. I played with it. He got rid of it after 1989 or whatever. But briefcases to me are a big thing. And so we had a gentleman come in that was from the Middle East, and he had a briefcase. And so right away, and his mannerisms were very awkward. There was multiple red flags. So I didn't know who he was. So I stepped up to, I went up to him and I introduced myself and I said, could you step over here real quick? We just want to do a quick search through your briefcase. And so he said, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Here. So he opens it up and, he had notes because he was preaching and the Bible and I made the connection. And while we were doing that, he said to me, "Oh," he's like, you're searching through my stuff because of my skin color, aren't you?" And that kind of just smacked me in the face at that point. And I kind of stepped back and I said, "No, actually, it has nothing to do with your skin color." I said, "Quite honestly, anyone that comes into the church that has a briefcase that wants to take it into the sanctuary, our policy, whether it's a briefcase or a backpack, our policy is to chat with that person and see, a little bit more information and search their bag and that sort of thing."
And he was sweaty and all the other indicators that you'd mentioned.
Exactly.
Yeah, those are things, yeah.
But to me, it was really funny because right away, he said, he was like, "Okay, it's because of my skin color." And I didn't even think about that in that situation. But right away, that put me on the defensive, right? Because I'm trying to justify my actions and go back and say, "Look, I have no concern over your skin color. What concerned me in this was your, your overall intent." And I think honestly, again, that's one of those things, like we were saying before, that often people get a little bit mixed up with the reasons that they're checking and they're doing stuff, and having a thought process to think through, to have a reasonable explanation. Like you said, it's not just about saying this person is suspicious. Why are they suspicious? We need to be able to articulate and have an answer for those individuals.
Yeah, and a lot of it, like I said, I don't want to keep coming back to the book, but when we look at a lot of these theories or concepts, that's why it's so key to have this evidence-based stuff. And we talk about implicit bias. I know we'll play that short video in a minute, James, but implicit bias, we all suffer from implicit bias. I have it all the time. I'm the father of a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old. I see how other parents treat their children. I see how they, we've got a swimming pool in our neighborhood, and then some of the parents will let a 5-year-old go off to a pool on their own. And I go there and say, "Is your mum or dad here?" "No." And then I'm forming a judgment on my parenting standards as to how I've been raised in middle-class suburbia, and all the things as to what I know. I'm judging that family as to, well, why are you letting the 5-year-old come to a swimming pool on their own? And what I'm really saying then is that my standard of parenting is better than your standard, and mine is acceptable and yours is not. So it's based on the different narratives as to how we've lived our lives. So it's really important to understand those things as to how they play a part in your views. Another example with children is, when they stay up late. I've had children knock my door at 9 o'clock at night, 10 o'clock at night. They're 7 years old. My parenting is saying, no, that is not acceptable. And I go to my wife and say, "Can you believe what that family have just done?" But again, my implicit bias, my standard, I'm saying that it's superior, mine is the right way, and how their parenting isn't. So it's just really understanding those narratives, and maybe we've got time to go into more of this stuff, but it's really as to where America is right now. There's so much implicit, explicit, and racial bias and all these different things that we're starting to understand now, and reflecting on what makes Simon the person I am is my upbringing, the environments, the things that I've done. Yeah.
I'm what I'll do this minute, or this movie is probably about 1 minute and 30 seconds. So I'll go ahead and play that, because this gentleman, Simon, did an interview with him and recorded it for his for Simon's video network. But we're going to upload it and actually play it, because he does a fantastic job clearly explaining what bias is, and for those of you that maybe don't understand it as clearly, like I didn't before we really started talking about it. So we'll go ahead and play that now, and then you guys can kind of watch that.
So explicit bias is how we treat people, right, by action. So our action towards certain communities or groups of people, or certain worshipers, or certain class of people. We have certain ways of treating people. So if you are in a restaurant scene and somebody says, right, that person looks like a good tipper, I'm gonna treat them a certain way. and then that person doesn't look like a good tipper, so I'm going to treat them a certain way. Even there, it's how explicit biases are formed, and then they are played out. So one is an unconscious process, and the other is it's visible in the way they're being treated. Steele does this work in Stanford, right? And he was invited by a engineering professor, and he said, I don't understand. We don't have enough women in our majors. Would you come and help us? And so Steele gets out there and he said, I want to sit in a class, in the beginning class of an engineering class, intro to engineering. So he gets up. He said, oh yeah, come on up. We are on the 3rd floor. They walked up, they scaled the stairs, they get to the classroom, and he sits in the classroom. He's looking at these things, and he gets up in the middle of the class, and he walks out, and the dean follows him, and he said, is there something wrong? He said, no, I was just looking for the bathroom. So, oh, the bathroom is just down the hallway. He said, I'm looking for the female bathroom. And the dean said, what? I said, yeah, I just want to know where the female's bathroom. Oh, we have a female bathroom. It's on in the basement. So there is this idea who belongs there and who doesn't belong there, right? So that whole structure of how the bathrooms are set.
Okay, so that was just a quick video, and I think I kind of tried to play them back to back because I do think they go hand in hand with what we're talking about, which is basically bias. What does it mean, and how, as a church safety team or in a church environment, how do we use this? It's not, by having this conversation, we're not trying to say you're doing something wrong, or how you're handling this is wrong. But I do think with our climate and our culture the way it is, that oftentimes if we understand some of these things, the better we understand it, the better we can handle and address, different things that come up, including probably one of the most regular things, which is suspicious people, and basically addressing that without discriminating or being racist or putting ourselves in a position that maybe we don't want to be in. So
yeah, and James, just to add on that, that is sort of a snapshot of what is about a 25-minute conversation with Dr. Raj, who is a professor of criminology, and focuses on implicit and explicit bias and sort of cultural diversity. And during that conversation, I've got a note here. He does actually say that our biases allow us to survive. He said our fight, fright, freeze mode are based off our biases. So a lot of it is just understanding. Like I said, everyone's got their own narrative. Build your implicit biases. We all have them, but it's really understanding the mechanics of what is causing those, to make sure it's when we get into that explicit bias, that's when we start running into difficulty, particularly in the house of worship, where I'm treating someone differently because it
Sure.
conforms to a different narrative to what I'm raised to. But Mr. Butler, you've been remaining very quiet in this conversation.
I've really been kind of enjoying this because, and I really want to come back. For those of you playing the home game, I've been messaging in the background here saying we really need to come back and revisit bias again, maybe August, September, because I think this is a hugely important topic, and I wanted to kind of spin up a couple of thoughts with it, because in church, I've had people come up to me and say, "Oh my gosh, this guy looks dangerous. You need to go watch this guy." Well, what he is shabbily dressed because he's homeless, and
Right.
so based on the fact that he doesn't look well dressed, now he's a threat. Well, that's a bias, and unfortunately, there are people that get attacked in the streets by homeless people or whatever. But the one I'm concerned about is the person who, like you're talking about, are they sweating profusely? Are they looking around? And a lot of times we give women a pass, whether it's law enforcement, security, or church security, because, oh, well, that's a woman, she's not a threat. And I have a friend who almost died as a law enforcement officer because he was about to have a gal committed. She was offered medication and crazy, and he assumed that she was not a physical threat because he outweighed her by about 140 pounds, was a mixed martial artist, was a boxer, was wearing body armor, and had all the tools of the trade on his body, until she suddenly screamed and lunged at him with a blade, and I mean, had a pretty good sized blade, and suddenly all of that didn't matter. He backpedaled, fell, she came down on top of him and hit, by the grace of God. He was wearing a solid steel plate on his chest, a literal plate carrier, because his county department, if you were out in the rural backwoods, they would let you wear hard plate. So he was saved by the fact that she was trying to kill him and hit this plate. His normalcy bias, a gender bias in his case, of perceiving a woman who was relatively calm and half his body size as being not a threat. There's a lot of things that we can end up in bad situations. I think, Simon, you and I have talked about the fact that drug dealers will move drugs on a woman's person, or hide weapons on a woman, even over to go to the Israeli thing in the Middle East. They have to be careful because of suicide bombers with vests and their women. And I want to come in quickly, and then I want to get Mike in here and get your comments. But we dealt with a guy today at church, and I'm kind of ad hoc to my church safety team, so I don't really have any rank, but I'll kind of throw thoughts in at times. And we had a guy come in. He had a fanny pack and he had a backpack on. I immediately pinged him, and we're at my rodeo. I would have wanted to say, come up and say, hey, we don't mind you having this. Would you mind open it real quick, or would you want to go back and put it in your car? But the guy had some obviously some psychological problems, and he ended up with some temper flaring issues just in short conversations with people. And then he was acting very, very fidgety. And these could be coming off of medication or whatever. But all of these things started to stack up. And so a gentleman on duty was talking to him and was kind of looking as he was going through his bag. And a pastor came up and started talking to him. And I was watching all of his body language, and I got assigned to be with the guy. And it was a whole lot less about, like you said, Simon, the bags. We got a pretty good look as he was going through his stuff and introducing us to things than it was his demeanor. And but I guarantee you there would have been people that had he not been acting fidgety, they would have never seen the bag. But then you would have had people that the only reason they would have noticed him was the bag. And of course, on the flip side of that, thank God that churches do bag checks, because it was in Texas that the guy walked up with a side fold rifle in a backpack, I think last year, wasn't that long ago. And they asked to do a bag check talking to a guy that appeared pretty normal. And he took a knee, went to unzip it and pull the rifle out. They tackled him and held him down. And so I think where the beautiful middle of the road is maybe is, hey, Mr. Buckner, nice to meet you. Noticed you had a bag. Would you mind if we check that real quick? And you're watching their demeanor up to that moment and then following it. Is the bag important? Yeah. Does it take a backseat to body language and all the things happening? Are they sweating and whatever? Absolutely. So anyway, Mike, you said you had something?
Yeah, I think there's to go on the non-threat side and in a church perspective, I think we could see it even in medical. You see somebody go down and you perceive that person to be younger. Is your response going to be just as rapid as if the person was 80 years old? Amen. And so I think you may pause and you may not necessarily chase after it, but what I really see a lot of it too is the attitude of some security teams towards parents. And that can be a church leadership thing, and it could be just something where, hey, we have kids' church. Why aren't your kids in kids' church? And so they have this idea that they have to somehow enforce not having kids in the sanctuary. But then that also plays out a step further. Let's take somebody who perhaps is a brand new parent, a mom, that is seeking to feed her child. And how often is it become something that says, oh my gosh, this is church. How dare you feed your child? And yet I think there's that bias that enters, that they immediately have this sort of visceral response to kids in church, a mother feeding her child, and they act upon it in a way that they think is a security duty, when in reality, it's just because they don't understand parents and they have a bias against that sort of thing.
Yeah, and Mike, you're exactly right. And it comes down to, like I said, me, you, Paul and James are of that generation where when I was 6-7 years old, I was kicked out of the house at 8 o'clock in the morning, and my mum didn't know where I was till 4 or 5 when I was hungry, and I was gone for 10 hours. That was perfectly normal. You flash forward to 2020, you say it to a parent now, and they're like, you don't know where your child is? They've been gone and out, they're 6-year-old. Have they been adopted? Because again, we're basing it on our narrative as to what's acceptable. So the biggest thing I can really say to safety officers is it's okay to have implicit bias because we all have them, but understand your narrative as to what has led you there. And then you need to look at the factual information to draw those conclusions to make sure you don't go towards explicit bias, because implicit bias leads to those judgments. And in houses of worship, that's when I don't feel welcome, I don't feel accepted. It's not a very nice community church, because in the eyes of the Lord, everyone is the same. So that's a great point to make, Mike. It is really true. We all fall foul of it. And like I said, kids are the best examples to give. Most parents in the 60s and 70s had no idea where their children were for 12, and that was normal. You fast forward now, someone's calling social services because that's the narrative where they are. So yeah, great point.
I wanted to toss in really quick, and this kind of goes over into other biases as well. But I mean, I remember being a kid in a all but strictly white church, because that was the area, and a large black family came to the church. And talking to people that week and the week after, nobody really knew how to respond. And I was raised that you love people regardless of the complexion that God gave them. And so I went clear across a 600-seat sanctuary and was greeting these people, but I was one of a handful of people that made the jump and went over there and said hello. And the interesting thing to me was you had some people who were very firmly racist. Let's just face it. Some of it was generational. But then you also had people who said, well, I didn't even know what to say. Hi, my name's Paul, is a really great place to start. And then on the complete flip side of this, and you and I have talked about this, James, and you and I have talked about this, Simon, I went to Kansas City, Missouri at my prospect, and I won't name the church because I don't remember the church and it wouldn't be right to say it, but this was love done right. And, heaven is going to be multicultural. Heaven is going to be multicolor if spirits have a color. And the fascinating thing to me about this is this church had people who were black, who were white, who were Hispanic. They were every color in the middle. And the pastor made us feel, we were a team that came in from 4 or 5 different churches, and here I am pulling security. And he made us feel so welcome. And he stood up there in front of everybody. He said, okay, folks, he said, today is National Hug a White Person Day. And he literally and we just got like bombarded. And it was the most amazing thing to see love done right. And I've seen the horrible extremes in the middle. And I try to be the guy. And I think this is the way that we all should be, that, hey, you're welcome here as long as you don't want to hurt anybody. We want you here. And the neatest thing in the world was my little church that I went to for 25 years, before the end, when our pastor passed away and I left just feeling called away, there were people from many different backgrounds, a number of different cultures, and a number of different blends of ethnicities that were all mixed in there. And I'm pretty sure heaven's going to look like that. So anyway, James, I know you got to wrap up.
Well, I just want to say one quick point is saying that you're right, and 70% of my book is about conversational interviewing, teaching people how to respond when you're in that situation. Moving past the bias, reaching out your hand, welcoming them to a church, holding a conversation to learn the intent. Like I said, I'm not joking. Someone could walk in the church holding the firearm. It doesn't concern me. I need to find their intent. I do that by having a conversation with them and find out.
Better have my attention.
Well, yeah, you got my attention, but I'm not fearful of it until I know their intent. That could be them shooting, but by then I know their intent. But you've got to, we're talking about real life. 99% of the time, these incidents are nothing. We've got to walk in with some grace and some compassion and just find out, what's the person's intent. We do that through what I call conversational interviewing.
Amen.
Well, absolutely. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight, Simon. It's always a pleasure. I love having you come in and chat with us, and it's for sure a topic that we certainly could spend a lot more time on. We kind of went over, so maybe one of these days, if Paul hasn't offended you too much tonight, we'll have you come back.
Now, maybe if I haven't offended people, I don't know if people like what I've got to say. But one quick thing I would say is that, I don't know if Mike posted the link to the book. I do have the video class on a link. So if anyone does buy the book and they're interested in going through the videos, send me an email to info@kingswoodsc.com and I'll send you the video class for free. So I just want people to be blessed and make sure they're coming from a position of grace.
Sure. All right. Thank you so much. We are going to wrap up real quick. And I just want to mention what we've got going on for the month of July. So the month of July, we're actually doing an entire month on what we call American Heroes. And next week will actually be part 1, and we'll be playing a recording of an interview that the three of us did with Pastor Frank Pomeroy. And so we'll have a great opportunity, very, very moving discussion with him about the active shooter at his First Baptist Church of Sunderland Springs. You don't want to miss that. And I think we're going to have to break it into 2 weeks, because we went, I think it's an hour and a half interview with him, which was just amazing. It was very humbling talking to him about that. But we are going to play that, and probably we'll hopefully get through about half of it, and we'll have the opportunity as we play it to just kind of chat about it amongst the three of us and share that with you. So we'll be talking to Frank. We're playing that recording, and then later in the month of July, we'll actually be talking or playing the recording of several other people that were involved with that and in that situation. And I think you'll be blessed by just the discussion. It's definitely something, if your church does not agree with the idea of a safety team, it's definitely something that you want to pass on. Send them the podcast, download it, whatever you can do to get them to listen to that 45-minute or two session episodes and be blessed by that. So I'm going to go ahead and ask Paul to close us in prayer tonight, and then we'll let you guys get on with your evening.
Dear Heavenly Father, Lord God, I thank you for these iron sharpens iron moments where we can do a gut check and make sure that our hearts that we're serving with a heart full of love. That, as Tina Rose says, church safety isn't something you do to a church, it's something you do for a church, Lord God. And that just resonated with me so deeply. So I thank you for tonight. I thank you for Simon. I thank you for James and for Mike. And Lord God, I ask that you give these men the desires of their heart. They do this for no money to serve you, Lord God. And even with Kingswood, so much of it is ministry based and not chasing money. And so I ask that you would guide, bless, and protect our churches, Lord God, and just help us to live in love for you. In your Son Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Thanks for joining us, guys. Have a great week, and we will see you all next Sunday evening at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. So take care.